So I think this is going to be a better use of our time if it really is dialogue. So I just want you to know that I like questions. You can interrupt me. You can ask for clarification. I think we learn best that way. And it's an opportunity, and I think that really calling is a very personal conversation. Yeah. And so in a corporate setting like this, I wish I could create time just for, like a 35-minute, 40-minute conversation with each one of you to just hear your heart. And I think if we take some time just to listen and talk through what God's placed on our heart, how he's wired us, how he's put us together, the places we're serving, it's amazing how much clarity can come with our calling. And so first I'm going to share, there's going to be kind of three components we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some of the bigger picture things of calling that we all share. Then we're going to talk about some specifics. But all the way along, the one thing that I kind of want to communicate, it's something that Jess and I both really feel strongly in. So even in our breakout this afternoon, we're going to talk about just deep prescribing ministry, is I want you to feel the freedom to understand that calling is about obedience more than anything else. It's just about you saying yes. See, because we can all in our minds picture what we think what a calling is, right? Maybe some of us were at a camp at some point, and you felt like God was calling you to ministry, or you sense the Spirit just confirming that. Maybe somebody spoke a prophetic word over you. I remember where I was when I first felt like, man, ministry would be something that I feel like God would have me do. And my mom passed away 8 years ago, but she had this little card she had saved from when I was in 6th grade that said, I'm going to be a pastor. And she saved it. And so when she passed away and I was going through some of her things, I found it, of course. And it was I kind of chuckled because while that was in 6th grade and while certainly it was confirmed when I was 15, kneeling by this one window in the cabin at Lake Retreat, and was filled with the Holy Spirit, and it was my calling was confirmed. Preached my first message at 16. That would be like the end of what you would say is a traditional, like what you think on-ramp. Because what you expect is, okay, then I chose to go to Northwest University, got my Bible degree, and took the next steps, right? That isn't. I'm one of 6 kids. My mom stayed home. My dad did not have a high-income job, and so we didn't have a lot of money. And so when I talk to our students all the time, I already know what it's like to get the scholarship to go to camp every time, right? And you hate to be the kid that has to ask every time, right? And the youth pastor's like, why aren't you coming to camp? We don't have money. I bought my own school clothes from the time I was middle school. So to fast forward and grab a picture, I had some success in athletics in high school, enough to continue on and run track in college. And so I went to a secular university. I was going to go be an attorney because the last thing I wanted to be was broke. And every pastor I knew was broke. Right? And so that was one of the guiding things and the weights that I felt. And it's because I felt like it could only look a certain way. And I realized I was looking for a pretty narrow lens. My experience was only in 2 churches at that point in my life. And those pastors weren't broke necessarily, but they certainly didn't live a lifestyle that I thought I wanted to live, being so impacted by not growing up with resources. And so I went away to school, and Jess and I, again, we were one of those couple of those people that got married young. We were 20 and 19 when we got married, in between our sophomore and junior year of college. And it was in the end of our senior year, literally like 3 weeks before graduation. And we were in a place where I always tell people, like, the best part about getting married young is you get to grow up together. The hardest part about getting married young is you have to grow up together. And I was super immature. And we just were at a place in our marriage where we were just kind of broken enough. We were sitting we went to a Foursquare church, and we went forward, and we received a prophetic word that basically called us out on our running from calling. And so we said, okay, we're not going to go to law school. We're going to pause. When we graduate, we're going to move back to our hometown, just get jobs, and learn what it's like to love Jesus and serve and just go. And we jumped in our local church. Church was like 125, 130 people at the time. And when a couple in their 20s walks in, a church that size, that's youth staff. And so they recruited us, and we jumped on the team, and we just began to serve. So we walked in the doors of Mount Rainier Christian Center in Enumclaw in 1998, and that's where we've been since. That's our home church still. Even though serving the network, we travel a bit, but that is still our home church. And all along the way, there was this nagging and just this pull. And I'm serving. Like, I'm in local church, right? And then the youth pastor would leave, and they would say, hey, Zack, we want you to be youth director for a season. And it's where I learned that it doesn't matter what your title is, right? You're called to serve students, and regardless. And then they hired a youth pastor, and guys, to be honest, the guy was a yahoo, and like slacker times 20, and he'd show up on, like, I was in charge of like games and activities at that time in our youth ministry, and he'd show up and say, like, yeah, I'm just not feeling it. Just play some games tonight. And I'm like, I work 60 hours a week, dude. And we had 3 kids at the time. Like, really? And that it'd be regular. And then, one time it's one thing, right? There's funerals and tragedies and things like that. And so you have grace. But when it's like 2 to 3 times a month, okay, we're sensing a trend here. And I just began to go, oh, okay, well, maybe ministry definitely isn't. But yet always was this thing. And our youth pastor, we had a youth pastor who was awesome, that came in, and he got me started in taking some global university classes, Berean, School of the Bible. And we just began to just take these courses and worked our jobs and served in youth ministry. My wife and our twins are here, and like the twins would be in their little car seats in the very back, just sleeping during youth, and we'd just be serving and going to camps and all this stuff. And as our kids got older, our son got into youth ministry, and we couldn't serve regularly. We started our own business, and we couldn't do the every Wednesday night thing in that time. We're coaching sports and just life, and so we said, we could still do activities, and so we'd go to camps and we'd run stuff at camps and be the hype people at camps. And throughout this, like, there's still just stayed this stirring. And part of it, I thought, okay, well, owning my own business would take care of that bug, right? Because a little entrepreneurial bug, and just kind of it'd be fun. And then we had a lead pastor change, and they said, hey, you got nominated to serve on the board. And I was like, no thanks. Hard pass. And don't have time for that. And he's like, you need to go to lunch and hear my heart. And so I went to lunch with him, and then I had to, they had let 2 names stand, and the other guy whose name was standing has always been on the board, right? Since the church started. You have to, you can serve 2 terms, then you have to be off for a year. And so I thought, okay, no problem. It'll be him again. And Jess is calling me a chicken the whole time. She's like, the only reason you let your name stand is because of him. I'm like, yeah, you're right. We kind of liked what we were doing. And in it, God's got a sense of humor, and so we were selected to serve on the board. And then I fell in love with my church, because not just serving in youth ministry now for activities and events, now we're seeing behind the scenes what it takes. And God just began to just continue to stir. And we sat and we were camping with our family. It was Labor Day weekend. And so it was like September, 4th or 5th. And we're camping. I said, hey, God wants us to continue the studies. I'm just going to pick them back up. And I don't know that he's going to do anything. And our business was just starting to rock. And it's like, this is good. Finally. It was just a grind for years. And she goes, well, if that's what God's telling you to do, then you better do it. And so I said, okay. 3 weeks later, my lead pastor calls and says, hey, we've got transition. And I'd shared some of my heart on this, but never fully. And he goes, God just put you on my heart. We got to go to lunch again. And it's like, when your lead pastor wants you to go to lunch, you're either in trouble or you're getting promoted. Right? It's one of those 2 things. And he says, hey, I can't escape this, that you're supposed to be. And they wanted me to serve as dual youth and children's. And I'm like, well, I called Jess and I said, hey, you remember that conversation we had in September about finishing our studies? Yeah. Well, this is the opportunity that's opening. And she doesn't miss a beat. She goes, duh. It's amazing how our spouses are usually ahead of us sometimes. And so not only was I immature when we got married, but I'm not very bright. She's ahead of me. So, And so we said yes, and that started our journey. And I tell you the story because you may be navigating a tug. We would both tell you, honestly, candidly, that until we said yes, my soul was not settled. I was going to be chasing after the very next thing. And once we said yes, it became settled. That doesn't mean it made anything easy at all, but my soul was settled because I knew that we were going to say yes. And it was a huge lesson. It's been this lesson all along for us that we just say yes to what Jesus puts in front of us. So like Jess said yes to serving. She's served the nursery coordinator for 10 years. Like children's workers, if I guess this is a children's conference, I said, hey, if you had somebody that would coordinate as a volunteer your nursery for 10 years, everybody's like, where's that person? Right? It's a big deal. And we did, and just all kinds of things. And it's looked different. But I tell you that because I want you to, I really mean it when I say to remove it from your mind that if God's calling you, he's going to make a way. Right? That if God's calling you, he's going to open up and he's going to place this thing in your heart, and he just keeps trying. He's faithful. He's not saying, okay, well, they missed that opportunity. I spent so many years thinking that ship had sailed. There's no way. I didn't start vocational ministry until I was in my mid-30s. And I felt like, okay, this is, clearly that's past. Clearly I certainly didn't hear from God when I was younger. Like that was, I missed. And really, he just kept waiting for me to say yes. Just say yes to the next thing in front of you. And so for a principle number one for you is like, just say yes today that will lead to a yes tomorrow. Just say yes today that will lead to a yes tomorrow. There aren't any insignificant serving roles in the body of Christ. And so when you say yes, what you're saying to Jesus is, you have permission to send me, place me, call me, to do whatever you want. Because in calling, it is not about a skill set. It is not about a skill set. It's about a willingness to say yes. So quickly we can think, oh man, that person is a dynamic personality. They must be called. And I just want to remind you that when they went to anoint King David, right, they lined up all his brothers. And in they walked, tall, handsome, rugged, quarterback of the football team, student body president, and they're like, that's got to be the right one. And God says, no. Man looks on the outward appearance, and God looks at the heart. And at the central to calling is God's not looking at what you can do. If God can speak through a donkey, right? If he can speak through a donkey, it's not like he needs a specific skill set. God just needs a radical obedience in saying yes. And so first and foremost with calling, it's about obedience. The center of calling is a heart to please God first. The mystification of calling is that we can feel we missed it, right? Which is hilarious when you think that if it's God who gives it, and if God's who's going to lead you, and you're just going to say yes, then you can't miss it. It might look different than what you saw in your mind or what you've had other people speak, right? Or you see modeled. It might look different. I just finished a master's program last year, and can I tell you the number one reason I wanted to take the master's program was because I had a secular BA. I have a BA in political science and did global classes. I felt that every time I stepped in the room, everybody else knew the Bible better than me. Just total insecurity, right? Because I didn't follow, if I would have been obedient when I was younger, and I would have gone to the Bible college route, I had an opportunity halfway through college even to switch. Northwest University offered me a scholarship to go there, and I made a financial decision. We were married, and it was like I can go to Central for $7,000 a year. That's how cheap it was when I was in school. You're like, what? That's everything. Or I could go to Northwest, which was only $24,000 a year at the time. And you're like, what? And we made that decision, and isn't it crazy how if God's going to call you to it. Like even though we say no along the way, that he's going to find a way. I laugh because like Jonah resonates with me, because like I went hard the other way from calling, because I was like, man, I'm gonna go. I told God I was gonna go do big things for him in politics and law, and I can like God kind of laughing at me, like almost audibly, like, really, like, you think that's how this is gonna work? And you try to run away, but God just continues. And even if he's gonna send a whale to swallow you, he's gonna do it. And so the heart to please God is at the center. That's the purpose. One of the pieces of calling is that all of us have this thing. We're wired to matter, right? We're wired to. We want to know that we make a difference. That if we just disappeared from the planet, people would miss us, right? It's just, relationships around us. We can see that, but part of calling is that we understand that we're made for a huge purpose, and that is to glorify God, right? To be offered to him, to say, you're going to use me however you want. And so the second thing is you got to sign over the check. If you're going to pursue calling, you have to sign over the check. That is probably the hardest piece. Like, there's the adventure people in here are like, okay, let's go. The people that like a structure and a plan, they're a little bit nervous, because when you hear they sign over the check, you think, okay, so like he could literally call me to like go to Russia in next year. And the answer is yeah. Yeah, he could. Isn't that great? But when you sign over the check and he's the one sending you, there's nothing more exhilarating or freeing than just saying, I'm saying yes, and this is what he's having me do. Because you know what that does? When you sign over the check, it means you can't fail. It's not your check anymore. It's his. And so when you say yes and you sign over the check, you can't fail. So you start a church, you plant a church, and it only lasts 3 or 4 years, and it goes, we're like, you were being obedient to go plant that church. You don't know why. You just said yes to go do it. You start a ministry. You tried something new in your youth ministry. It's like, God's calling us to try this, and it tanks horribly. Which, if you've done this for more than like 8 minutes, you've had something tank horribly. And yet, it doesn't matter, because you're just being obedient to what God's called you to do in that season, in that moment. I can't tell you how many times there's things that we thought were great ideas, and you look back and go, that was the dumbest thing. And we shouldn't do that. We should look back and go, no, we just said yes. If it was our idea, maybe it was dumb. And I have plenty of those. But when it's God's calling you to it. So I want to look at shift gears and kind of talk some practical things, and then I definitely want some questions. So practical things. Corporate calling. There's things that are true for all of us. God has given every single person a gifting. Nobody missed when God was giving out gifts and wiring you. That passage, Pastor Steve, I'm going to share it later in the altar service. That was a confirmation of a prophetic word spoken over you 2 years ago. And you have been given and wired specifically. That's challenging because the person sitting next to you is very different. See, we're friends, right?
Yeah,
Ish.
yeah.
Okay.
You know me.
I've never slept in a nightgown.
Yep.
You have.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Try it. It's really good.
We're wired differently. But I can celebrate the heck out of that. One of the things that God's really working on me is maybe you like seafood, like lobster, crab, and that kind of stuff, right? It's disgusting. So, but one of the things that God's working on me is you find yourself in a space and someone says, I really love sushi. And we feel this urge. I do. But we feel this urge to go, oh, I hate that. Why can't we go, that's just so cool that God wired you to like bottom feeding, sludge drinking. Why can't we just celebrate that? Because we're looking so much for outside. No, maybe God has wired you to serve students behind the scenes. And you are called to be a team builder and an encourager, and you're never called to touch a microphone. We got to get better at celebrating that calling. Because calling's about a wiring, it's about your personal, And so it's true for every single person here. God has made you. He's knit you together. He's created you, and he's gifted you to be you. Yes. Okay? So these are things that are true for all of us, right? Corporate things. Second, part of the true for all of us is that we all have a place. There's no gifts that are excluded. I learned this lesson so valuable years ago in our local church. We had a leader come to our church named Matt. Matt was about as awkward socially as you could get. He's a video game guy and just not a lot of social skill. But he's like, I feel like God wants me to be a youth leader. And I just, okay, dude, let's go. And after one Wednesday night, he's like, wow, that's a lot. And we had a rough youth ministry. I'll just be honest. We were the church that was like known in the community for the kids that like the rough kids went to that youth ministry. And like we had other churches dropping off bad students in their vans in our parking lot because they're like they can't be here, and so they could come to our church. So it wasn't like nice and proper. Everybody with their Bibles open, right? That was not our youth ministry. And we'd have drunk students tell me they hate me on a regular. So that's just youth ministry, right? But he came and he's like, wow. But he came back. And he's like, wow. And then he finally came up to me after the third week and he said, after watching a couple of people up front doing some stuff, he goes, I can't be your youth leader. And I said, why? If God's calling you to do this. And he said, I can't be them. I can't do that. And my initial response was, buddy, I'm your guy. I'm going to find you a place in this church to serve. It's okay, right? God's called you, and so, and then Jesus, just how those moments are, and I get this image where Jesus, they got the 5,000 in front of them, and they're like, hey, we got to send them away to get food, and Jesus is like, you give them something to eat. And I just felt like God said in that moment, like, you give him something to do. I've called him to be here. Right? I've called him to be a youth leader. And I'm like, God, have you seen him? And he has no interest. And God's like, give him something. And so I said, Matt, let's talk. Like, you're a video game nerd guy. And he's like, yeah, totally. And I said, would you be willing to lead a team of students in the tech? Like, would you learn the lighting? Would you learn sound? And he goes, I can't sing. I said, well, neither can I. But I can move faders. and I said, you can make them sound good. And he's like, because he was willing to say yes and let it look different than what he expected it to look, he became just a phenomenal, and the students that went back there is not going to be a shock. They looked a lot like Matt's. But if Matt doesn't find a place to serve because he's called, where do those students find a place? Yeah. And so Matt built this team, and it was an awkward group, right? They sat together like we'd eat dinner before youth, and they sat together. I want to be at that table. I want to know what they're talking about. I'm sure I wouldn't understand it, but I want to be there. But it was such a lesson because every single person is called. And if we define it too narrow, how many people are we defining and telling them their calling is invalid? Yeah. And so we want to confirm that everyone's called. Everyone has a place. Nobody's excluded. We're part of a body. There's a reason. It says if one part suffers, right, a whole part suffers. And so that's true for all of us. Those are things that we can, you can point to Ephesians 2:10, that you're his masterpiece, created to good works before you were even born, right? You are his masterpiece. That is calling 101. That you are designed for a purpose. Psalm 139, of course, speaking of the design itself in detail. Let's talk about personal calling. Calling will always be beyond you and me. It'll always be. If you feel like you've arrived at a place where you have achieved a level of, whether it's education, experience, whatever, that you can now serve in something, you aren't called to it. Because if it's called to it, it's going to be God working through you. It's going to be beyond you. There's not a day, not one ministry role that I've ever served in where I feel like, yeah, God, you got the right guy. There's never been one day in my life that I sense that. Every day I go, God, I don't know how I'm going to do this. Don't let me mess this up. Like I secretly was hoping 10 people would come in here so that only 10 people I could possibly like not mess up. And that's just being honest, because we don't understand. Like God's going to call you, God's going to give you, and and you have to be willing to say, man, God, it's not going to be about how I feel or how I see myself. I can't educate myself into calling. I can't skill set myself into calling. We can skill set ourselves into serving. That's fantastic too. That's not belittling that. Like, like you learn an instrument so that you could serve on a worship team. You don't necessarily feel called to be a worship leader. That's fine. That's serving. But if God's calling you to something, it's going to be beyond you. I know, a lot of people that, man, like they sense like there's a specific. You're called to be an evangelist. You're called to be a missionary. You can be very specific with that calling, and that is where we talk about being very personal. And how do you listen and discern that? And I think probably like some of the questions like it would be like, how do you know like what God's calling you to, right? That's that specific thing, and I'm partially lousy at that because I kind of gave you the answer at the beginning. For us, it's like we just said yes to what God's put in front of us, right? We knew God called us to ministry. There wouldn't be a lot that would surprise us anymore if God said, hey, we want you to do this, and we'd say, well, if that's what you're going to put in front of us, we're going to say yes to it, right? There wouldn't be a lot that would surprise us anymore. We don't necessarily, we don't feel a call to foreign missions to go. We go on short-term trips. We believe in them. They are life-changing. My own kids would tell you the life-changing experiences to go on a foreign mission trip. I'm gonna support. I'm gonna be part of that. But we don't necessarily feel that call to be part of that. Outside of that specific one, there's nothing. My wife would say she's never called to go somewhere where the temperature drops below 30. Right? She's like, Jesus loves her, and the calling is to places that are warm and tropical. We did have a youth pastor once that was called to the Cayman Islands. I'm like, sure you are. Friends of Theron and I, they went to plant a church in San Diego. I'm like, yeah, I feel like God calling me here to plant a church too. It's like 75 degrees every day, sunny, it's beach, it's amazing. But it's about saying yes to what's in front of you. The personal call, you can be fully personally called to know exactly what that is and never receive a paycheck from a church or a faith organization. That's one of the things that in personal calling that we really, we kind of have to remove, like, oh, if you're called, you're paid. No. No. If you are under that assumption, what we begin to believe is that there's something more special about the calling. Which if we follow that through in theology, what we're saying is there's something more special about the God that called them, but not the God that called me. And so when we talk about your personal calling, you don't have to think of it in terms of paycheck. It's about opportunity to serve. It may become a paycheck. If you're thinking that maybe you're called to youth ministry, I tell them the number one thing to do is just start serving and serve your guts out and just be faithful for a long time. I can't tell you how many people I know that were called to that and worked themselves into a paid position at some point. It's not a guarantee, right? There's not like a plan for that. But you are going to want to, if you believe it's a calling today, you're going to work at it, or tomorrow you're going to work at it today. It's always an interesting conversation when I sit down with a recent college graduate that says, hey, I want a youth ministry job, and lead pastors reach out to me and say, hey, we've got youth pastor positions open, and they send it, and then I'll sit down and youth pastors will call me up, say, hey, we're feeling like we should transition, but a college student will call up and say, hey, I'm graduating. I'd like to get a job in youth ministry. Can you give me some counsel? We sit down and say, okay, so tell me about where you're serving. And they're like, what do you mean? Okay. I'm asking what church are you plugged into? Like, that's the scarier one when they say, Well, I kind of go here sometimes, and I kind of go here sometimes. That's a scarier answer. But I always kind of come back and say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go find a local church and just give them your guts. I don't care what, a Jesus-loving, Christ-centered church. And I tell them, like, I love the Assemblies of God. I believe in it. I love being part of a family that we can link arms and go in one direction. I think that's powerful. But by no means do I think we're the only ones that are doing it. And I'm like, so if you want to go Foursquare, go Foursquare. You want to go non-denominational, do that. But find a church and just start serving. I said, because what you got to be able to look at a lead pastor and say, I've at least led a junior high girls small group or a junior high boys small group if you want to be a youth pastor. It's probably helpful, right, to have some practical experience. They're going to want to know what you've been doing. And so start serving today for the picture you see tomorrow. Serving the kingdom is, calling in the church is not the same as calling in the kingdom. Calling in the church is not the same as calling in the kingdom. See, kingdom calling is what we're all called to. Calling in the local church is what we are supposed to do. Right? I have to be honest with you. This is one of the things I'm so passionate about. The local church is the hope of the world. Because when you think about your community, it doesn't matter like you think your community might not be very diverse, or anything, and the people that attend your church might all look the same, whatever. Like when you still think about the diversity of experiences sitting in that room, and the fact that those people come together regularly, it doesn't happen anywhere else in the world, right? And so the calling there is to be the church. Calling kingdom is to be the church in the world, right? Outside. I'm going to jump to a quick passage, talk to just some practical things, and then I want to take some questions. Understanding, first, top thing to remember is that calling is God-initiated. It's God-initiated. Ephesians 4 said, So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers. And the key, verse 12, is to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach a unity in the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure and the fullness of Christ. It is God himself who created these places and these within the church and these roles, and that we have formalized and somewhat professionalized, which that's a huge debate right now, and in the church world is, how we over professionalized calling, and started just like you're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a pastor. We've professionalized calling versus saying it's a kingdom language that we need to come back to, recenter on. But calling is about Jesus giving those things to those who should say yes to serve in a specific role. But what's the purpose? So often we can think arriving at a role is about our arriving. And this is like, no, you're going to serve in that way for the sake of others. So calling is always others focused. It's never centered on the person. You'll find yourself disillusioned with calling quickly if you think it's about you. And it's because it's always going to be about others. You're signing up when you say yes to Jesus every time. You're signing up to say, God, you're going to use me to grow and benefit other people. And what a beautiful thing to be used for, right? To equip people for the works that God created them to be. If we say yes to Jesus, what does it tell the person sitting next to us? And if we say yes to our calling and we walk in it, whatever it looks like, how many mats, that are we going to discover? Timing can be a big question in calling. And I think my story, so the timeline, you don't get to choose it. You don't get to choose the timing because it's God who's going to call, and that's on his timing. Even though we may earnestly desire it and actually pursue it and seek after it, which we should if we have a sense of it, it's going to be God who calls. So some quick things. First, listen. Start with listening. We listen to God. Pastor Steve was spot on. We've got to get on our face before God. We have to learn to know the heart of God, and because if he's going to call us, he's going to speak to us, and it's his voice that's going to guide us and lead us. We're not following a job description. We're following Jesus. Okay? Depending on your age, depending on where you're at in life, parents, right? Parents are a great place to listen. But make sure whoever you're listening to, and this is huge when it comes to calling, make sure that they are listening to the Holy Spirit. There can be very practical advice and actually very just amazing wisdom given. But it can also be very worldly. At the intersection, when I had an opportunity to go to Northwest, all the advice I listened to, not one of them, not one person that I called that I believe would tell me something that was centered on what God would want for my life. They were looking at just one practical, and worldly wisdom perspective. It wasn't. They weren't trying to harm me. But I didn't call one person and said, "Hey, I feel like God might be stirring me to maybe go to this Bible college and get a degree, and because He's called me. Would you pray?" And I didn't talk to one person. The only voice was Jess. She's like, "Well, what does God want you to do?" I didn't like that question because I chose the other one. So when you're listening, listen to people that have your spiritual good at heart. Begin to say yes to anything now. Right? Become the minister of chairs in your youth ministry. Right? Say yes. Rock it. And serve your guts out. The secret to growing as a follower of Jesus in general is simply serving. Because the more selfless we become, the more Christ-centered we become. Right? You want to discover your calling, you're going to have to die to yourself. Get a mentor. Grab a mentor. Someone that's been there, done that. And say, hey, let's have a conversation of what it looks like to navigate this in a real way. In a season where I was down about my calling, I'll never forget this guy, Jack, coming across our church, put his arm around me and said, just want you to know. And I have no idea what this means because I never shared anything. Jack lives in Alaska, shoots bears. And that's I think he just hunts them with a knife in his teeth. I mean, he's that guy. And Jack, he just put his arm around me and goes, I don't know what this is about, but God wants you to know that he's going to restore what you think the enemy has stolen. He didn't know. No idea. But he became a mentor in my life because I could tell he was listening to God. And I knew I needed more of that. Yeah. And then when it comes to calling, this is a challenging statement. If you can see yourself doing anything else, you should do it. If you can see yourself doing anything else, you should. Because calling isn't going to be like just a career path that you get to dictate and take steps, and you can predict your income, and you can show where your retirement's going to be. Calling is not going to be that road. And so if you can see yourself doing something else at all, do it. Cool. Questions, comments, snide remarks? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about so I hope this isn't confusing. Can you talk about the relationship between, I guess, the spiritual side of calling, listening to the Lord, but also the practical side in a day-to-day sense?
Are you talking about just walking in obedience in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I don't know. I guess I think I've had moments, especially when I was younger, where I'm looking for a door to open or someone to call me or whatever else. When really I just needed to just be obedient and pray more.
Yeah, so that's the mystical side we were talking about of calling, right? Yeah. Where we think, if God's going to call me, there's going to be the airplane in the sky is going to spell it out, right? And we like to lay fleeces before the Lord. They're like, you know what, God, but those things can happen. But I think what Pastor Steve shared is so perfect because those come on the other side of prayer, not on okay, I'm going to dictate what I'm going to pray, and look for that. And so the practical side is, if you're called, if you feel calling, and if it's youth ministry, jump in and serve in youth ministry. If it's kids ministries, jump in and serve kids ministries. If you don't know, do it all. Say yes, and I don't mean run yourself ragged. You're cool, that's great. No, I mean, just feel the freedom to explore what your calling would be by serving, right? So commit. Say, listen, I don't know if I'm called to student ministry, but I'm going to commit to 6 months. I don't know if I'm called to kids ministries, but I'm going to commit to 6 months. And the children's pastor at Mount Airy Christian Center, right where our home church is, walked into my office and said, God's called me to be a pastor. And she's like, I'm a school teacher, but I'm going half-time this year. You get me for 20 hours a week. You tell me what you want me to do. And I was like, I got to do what? Like, I'd had interns, but I'd never had someone come. And she's like, no, I want to walk alongside you. Go up to your youth pastor, children's pastor, lead pastor, say, hey, God's calling me. I can give you this. Put me to work. Anybody else? Yeah.
So, if we know like where we're at is only for a period of time,
Mm-hmm.
how do we kind of lean into that and make the most of that, even though we know, like I don't know where God's calling me, but I know it's not youth ministry forever, or even for beyond this period of time that I'm in.
Yeah.
So how do I lean into that now?
You're gonna keep saying yes until God says something different, right? If you set the timeline, like, okay, Lord, like, I'll give you 3 months to tell me what you want. I'm not sure the Lord's gonna. I was, oh, really?
You got me until I graduate college, and now I never leave that town and
Right.
never leave youth ministry.
Yeah.
20 years.
Right, and that's the other side of it. So what you do is you be faithful today. If there are, like, if you do feel like there's a vocational calling and you need to get some study, then you pursue those things today. And it might take a long time. It took me like 6 years to really get through my first set because I was working on the business, all those things. It took me like 6 months to do the next set because I had more time to do it and focus on it. So saying yes, to that, and then just waiting, and just praying and seeking God, because then He might say, "I'm actually doing something significant in you right now." Because that's the biggest, huge piece of calling is that it's not about what you're going to be doing; it's about what God's going to be doing in you while you're there.
Yeah.
And so just yielding at that time. You can start, plugging away, and again, without a preconceived idea of what it has to look like. Yeah.
When you said like God has given every single one of us gifts, I'm in a stage of life right now where I'm trying to figure out like what exactly those gifts are and what they look like. How do we become more aware of the gifts God has given us?
Obviously there's spiritual gift assessments, right? You can take those, and you can, and a lot of what you're talking about is how you're wired and made.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of things out there, Enneagram, disc profiles, all these things. All those things are really great tools for self-awareness. And I'm a big fan of all of them, because the more we understand how God's made us, right? We stop feeling pressure to be something else, because that's my wife is a C on the disc, which means she wants all the information, like every step, like all of it, right? And I just need a general direction. Like, we're going that way. That looks like fun. I think I'll try it. Right? That's my personal. And so, so that's one. Second, ask people around you that are close to you, the closest to you. Like, do you see this? Like, or what do you? Just tell me what you see. Just ask those questions. If you were to name my top 3 things, when you've known me for a long time, and have them describe your personality, it's like, because you might go, oh, I'm such an extrovert, and they're like, you hate people. so it's like, because they see you, and sometimes people see the mask, but let's talk to the people close to us that know us. Yeah, it's a great question.
So I don't know if you can speak to this. I feel like you've already answered some of my questions, but I have this opportunity at my church to serve, and it kind of just makes so much sense that I'm like skeptical of it, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like, God, there must be something bigger or more challenging than just like something that I've kind of been like trained to already do. It's like taking over a role that's something I've been interning for.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel this tug of like, what if there's something more? What if I'm supposed to like do something kind of more out of my league? Okay. Like you were saying, like something I feel less qualified for. But then like it makes so much sense that I take this role at the same time. So I'm kind of just very conflicted about that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can.
So I would say the only reason you'd say no is if you don't think you're going to be obedient. You know, I think one of I'm trying to think who said it, so I can't give him credit, but one of the biggest tragedies of our day is when you become really good at something you were never meant to do. Right? And so really what you're saying is that you're fearful that you're going to say no to what your real calling is because this is in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
But being faithful with what God places in front of you now says, God, you can trust me with something different or more later. Yeah. Scripture says, right? I'm going to trust you with this. You're going to steward this. And if you steward that well, this is the best part. You know what the reward of a job well done is? More work. Right? It's more work. Right? So if you're obedient now, God's like, I can trust you. And I'm going to trust you with more. God's going to trust us with teenagers, which is scary. And we might be saying, well, God, I know you've called me to be a lead pastor. And so we discount how we treat teenagers. God's like, you're going to treat my kids like they're lesser than the adults? No. Be faithful now, fully. So, to answer your question, is if you feel that it'd be disobedient, right? If you feel in your spirit, you talk to people that are listening to the Holy Spirit, for your spiritual benefit, not for your earthly gain or those like what makes sense and practical only, and then you say yes with freedom, because you can't miss obedient. When you say yes to Jesus, you don't miss calling. You don't, because it didn't come from you. Yeah.
Do you feel like when you said yes to your calling, like you and your wife, did you guys ever have any kind of struggles where you guys were on the same direction, but did you ever feel like you guys butt heads in some things, in areas, especially when you were...
Jess, did we? Yeah. So, I felt called to be a pastor. I wrote that when I was in 6th grade. Jess, when did you find out?
I was 21, 22.
So we'd already been married for 2 years before I even told her that was even something in my life. So you think that might bring some tension? She says, wait. So let me get this straight. I thought I was marrying a lawyer, and I married a youth pastor. Those income levels aren't the same. Right? And so, there was.
So how did you press forward?
So great, really good lessons. Number one, I overserved because I was saying yes to everything. But in that, I was neglecting my family. And so, I would literally say these. It's so bad. I'd say, it's not like I'm at the bar. I'm at the church. I said that. Those are literal words that came out of my mouth. And it's horrible, right? And so, and it wasn't because she was just saying, hey, every time you say yes, remember you have a family too. And I've, it was, there was tensions there. There were tensions in expectations because, again, if you're married, even though the church, they're hiring you to be the pastor or you to be the pastor, youth ministry, there's 2 roles in the church, I believe, that have expectations on the other spouse, and that's youth and lead. I did dual youth and children's, and people left Jess alone about children's, but they did not leave her alone about youth, right? There was a high expectation in youth, and so that was a tension because we had little kids get snotty, and when kids get a cold, they all get a cold, and it stretches out for 4 weeks instead of just being a couple days, and so they're like, your wife's MIA. I'm like, yeah, she'd love to be here too, but we got snotty kids, and we have to set the example that we're not going to put sick kids in the nursery. So how do we accommodate, it's not like this is pre-Zoom and check-in and watching streaming stuff, right? It wasn't so there were all kinds of those pieces. Where we were in agreement was, if this is what God's calling us to, we're going to say yes, and we're going to figure it out. So that, no question. Yeah.
I just also want to add that we made it a priority to not surrender to ideals.
Yeah.
Okay, because ministry looks different in different seasons. So we just made it a priority to ideals placed
Yeah.
on us by
Yeah.
position, by what the world says we're supposed to do, by what, somebody in ministry did that worked for them.
Yeah.
That was not our ideal.
Which this is, I mean, our breakout this afternoon is literally that's that topic, is navigating that specific topic, and that is you just have to, what you can't handle what other people are doing, but inside, yeah, you have to. There were, like, she was like, I'm gonna commit to leading this ministry, and so like we would high five and I'd take the kids and she would go, and like you have to navigate those things, but yeah, there was tension, especially because it was a change, and again we'd already. Like when we told our kids that we were becoming youth pastors, so our oldest son was a senior, our twins were in 6th grade, and our youngest was in 2nd grade. And we're sitting around the table, and like you could see this, like it was not the reaction I was hoping for as a dad. They were not happy their dad was going to be their youth pastor, right? And it was just like, like they were trying to be like, we know we can't show we're mad. But because it was very different, they were used to self-employed dads. So. Yeah.
How did you discern, like, I know the idea of like saying yes to everything, but how do you discern like saying yes to the right things? I think we could even say yes to something that could either take us away from what God's truly calling us to, or even leaving things earlier than we should. And so, where did like on your walk of like, okay, like, is this a thing I should say yes to, or is this somewhere where I should be obedient and waiting right where I'm at?
Yeah. And so there's going to be a personal spiritual side of that,
Right.
Because you're listening. We did dual youth and children's, and at a summit like 6-7 years ago, God clearly spoke that our season in children's was going to be coming to a close. And I didn't like that. I liked doing dual. Now it's going to kill me, but I liked it.
Yeah.
But we knew that, and so we just kind of began navigating that, talking to people. It wasn't even like 2 weeks after that, larger church in our network calls us, hey, we want you to come be our children's pastor over all of our campuses. And I'm like, oh, that was so great 3 weeks ago. But we knew.
Yeah.
So partially because we knew what God had already spoken, that's what we know. It was the same thing. Again, so many huge moments at Summit. My very first Summit, and we were trying to debate whether or not we keep our business open to like offset some income things, and God just clearly spoke, said, you are trying to leave the back door open. I have called you to this. I'm going to take care of it. Shut it. And I was like, don't like that. And then from the platform, one of the speakers said, God just has this laid this on my heart that there's somebody here that's trying to keep the back door open. And so that's a confirmation of that word, and so we knew. So part of that question that you asked is telling, because there's a motive that you have to check in your heart, because calling's from God.
Yeah.
And so you're like, I don't want to miss. And so we think, man, if I take this church, maybe a bigger church won't call me. We can't. Yeah, that's not kingdom. If God's calling you to it, you're saying yes to it. If you believe, if you can't say yes to it wholeheartedly where you're at right now, you won't be ready to say yes to something else. So, because you're never fully there,
Right.
which is like horrible. So all the questions have come from this side. Okay.
So what if you felt a calling and you went into the calling and then you felt great and happy for years, but then it slowly started to trickle back, like, is this really something that I'm meant to do? And you're kind of questioning it.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say? How would you pass that?
Every single person faces that space.
Yeah.
There's no timetable for it, but you can come to a space where you're like, is this really, especially if we're in a tough season, right? Maybe your ministry shrinks, or you're just, it feels like a grind, and so that's time with the Lord personally, and then the other one is like, we can't, if we say yes to a calling based on a feeling, we're gonna say we're out based on a feeling. Okay, so it's about obedience, and so Yeah, if I said yes because I was all excited, I was all hyped, and yes, this is gonna be great, Nike Dunks, wah wah wah, I mean, if that's what we're saying yes to, then we'll say no when there's a low night. And so you can't, and so you have to, so you stay until you feel, because God will unsettle you, He will stir you, and it could be for something different. And this role, this is never on my radar ever. Like when you come to this role, they give you these things hey, just so you know, a lot of youth pastors dreamed about having this position. I'm like, really? I just called to serve the next generation, and just in that, and so we just said yes to it, and then look, yeah. So that's what happened. And so it wasn't because we were discontent, but we knew a year before this God was stirring us. We assumed, our lead pastor would have assumed, that it was because we were going to begin to take on a level of leadership in our local church that was going to be eventually taking the church in a number of years. And so we would have said that's what God's stirring us for, that He's getting ready for us to exit youth ministry. And He left. So, yeah. But you stay all in where you're at.
What about when everything in us wants to not do what God has called us to do? Like Jonah, go on, go the opposite
Feel
direction.
that, yep. Well, then you're going to be miserable. No. You're going to be vomited on a beach. And that is not a pleasant experience. The only answer, guys, when we come to Jesus is yes. And it's the only answer. And so the sooner we learn it, the better.
Does it get easier to say yes?
How do I say that? Does it get easier? That's tricky. In one way, I think yes, because what it builds is trust. Right? Your faith grows with every yes. Your just faithfulness to youth ministry. I know there's mostly leaders in here that you're not getting a paycheck, and but your faithfulness and serving, it builds your faith because you're just saying yes. It doesn't feel like that, but every Wednesday night or Tuesday or Sunday, what you're saying to Jesus is, I'm going to be used by you for teenagers that smell bad. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so it doesn't get easier. It builds your faith, and so that makes it go. It actually get harder. The ask may get bigger, but because of the faith, you could say yes. So that in that way, it makes it easier.
So if you know that you've been called, how do you get your family on board behind your calling? Because I just personally live with I'm single and I live with my family, and I hear all the time you're never home. I get you're invested in the church. I know that you feel you're called to God, but you're gonna make no money in ministry. And how do you get them on board with that? Because when your family doesn't support you, it just feels so discouraging. Is this what God really is calling me to? How do you navigate that?
Like I said, I'd love to spend 30 minutes with you. Actually, you need to spend 30 minutes with Jess, because she would just... that is a challenging side of calling, is saying yes to Jesus. There are going to be people that don't understand. When we shut our business down, people are say, what? You go from that to youth ministry, and it's we just trust Jesus is going to take care of it. And so I would encourage you to think, we focus so often on the cost, we'd say the cost of calling. That's real. There is a cost that's tangible, but there's also an example, right? Your faith will be example. It would be it'll be more real when people say they just walked off the map and said yes, and they're just trusting Jesus, and that doesn't make sense to people that want to plan and a career and all those things, but that's an example of faith. They're she truly believes that this is God's calling in our life, and so obviously as you get older, and by no means am I saying tell your parents to pound sand, but I am saying that you model that example and you say yes. And there's going to be a place when you arrive, and whether age or marriage, all those things, and you will. You're serving Jesus, and your parents might have dreams for you, and so what you're saying is, what you're telling them God's calling you to is different than the dreams they had for your life. And so you need to have some grace, right? You need to have some grace for them, but at the same time, your obedience to Jesus is going to be the key. So, so that get people around you. So when nobody else understands, you have those people that are listening to the Holy Spirit that fully understand, that are going to intercede on their behalf, that are going to believe for favor from your parents. Like we're just going to believe that God's going to change their hearts, and they're going to be your biggest cheerleaders. Right? So, yeah, we'll take 2 more. Yeah.
Maybe it's just that I don't like the answer you've given. I'm like, well, maybe if I ask
Yeah.
it, he'll say it different. And,
No.
So, is calling and spiritual giftedness like super linked? Because like the things I find myself good at and people say I'm good at, and like apparently I'm good at preaching, and you know I did it 5 or 6 times last year, and I never liked it. It's like.
So you're probably decent at it because nobody likes it if they like to preach.
If I'm, do I have to like the things I'm called to do?
No. No, like there's not a job in the world that you get to like everything about it. Like there's not one. It's like, you know, Bill Gates has things he hates. You know, there's NBA players, there's things they hate about their job, right? And so, no, it's not all about that. But we shouldn't be miserable, right? Because there's no joy in it. But that could be more attitude than gifting.
Talking about like the whole serving and you might not ever get a paycheck, being in ministry or whatever that looks like.
I don't mean that from a discouraging standpoint.
No, like, so I feel like there could be times, I know I'm like young, so right now I'm just doing everything and I'm just serving wherever I can and saying yes as much as I can. And I know, like you were saying, it can look different for everybody. So how do you balance if it might just look like you're serving behind the scenes and you don't ever maybe get a paycheck from a church because you just stay in that position of serving? But how do you also balance that practical side of like, you get older, you get married, you have kids, like there's a financial piece. So I feel like there's this battle. It's like, yes, I'm trusting you, God, but there's also a reality. So how do you trust God but also not go into things blindly and like knowing there's no finances there?
Yeah.
It's just like that really like practical and spiritual.
So when you're younger and are you married?
No.
Okay, single, you have more time.
Yeah.
In some ways, right? And in some ways not, right? In a couple, you have 2 people to do things. A single does everything, like grocery shop, everything. You have to do it all for yourself, right? And different seasons you're going to be able to give different things, and that's why we're not prescriptive with calling. Because you're called to serve Jesus. You're called to carry and to see the kingdom advance and use what God's given you to do. That's your calling, and that can look very different over different times. When if and when, I'm not going to like, you have 19 kids. No, don't speak that over me. No, but that'll change. And one of the things, my favorite things, Becky brought Vera, her daughter, with her, right? So she's holding her in the green room, and I'm like, Becky, this has to be like, people have to see this, like especially our young women in ministry, that like she's called. And Vera knows green rooms and conferences because she's gonna be with her mom. And so if she was like, no, if I'm only gonna be called to be only a mom, and if that's what God called her to, she'd have to be obedient to that. But if God's calling her to keep doing what He has her doing, then she's your baby. And so it's just but you have to get it out of your mind that it can only look a certain way. As far as the financial side of that, you're gonna work a job to pay your bills and serve, and jobs change and responsibilities change and go up typically, right, as you grow in a role, and but that just comes down to being honest with the conversation of what you can give in that time. And God is not, it's about obedience. So God's not going, you gave me 24 hours a week when you were 22, and now you're down to just 14 hours a week. You need to pick it up. God does not, that's not God, right? And so it's just obedience. Cool. Well, it is like past, and I apologize. So we're going to head to lunch, and so I'm going to turn it over, and I think she's going to pray for lunch and get us out of here. Yeah.